everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Many of you have asked for this session, and I appreciate that feedback. We wanted to make sure that we delivered and got you what you needed. And I wanted to introduce our social media and media relations team. Stephen Norris is going to kick off things in just a second. He's our director of media relations and social media. And then Evan is here as well, and Bryce is going to be joining soon from our social media team. Really appreciate the time you guys are giving us today to give us your recommendations and advice. And they've got a presentation deck that they're going to run through, and then we're going to definitely leave a good amount of time at the end for your questions. Stephen, I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Angela. We appreciate the time today and understand that this is something a lot of folks are interested in, and we see social media as being a really important tool for us here at Georgia Tech of telling our story about sharing not only what it's like to be at Georgia Tech every day, what it's like to be a student, what it's like to be a faculty member, what it's like to be a part of our community, but it's also an opportunity for us to share our thought leadership. And we're seeing a lot of creative ways that other folks are using that. There's some people on campus who are doing that as well. And we understand it can also be a little bit daunting. So one of those things of all the other stuff we have to do in the day, how could we possibly take something else on? But we've focused on trying to build a very strategic community on social media for Georgia Tech that is focused on engagement. And it's really applicable for our faculty members and researchers as well to use these tools with a lot of benefit. And so we wanted to walk through some ideas today. And Evan, we can probably go ahead and put it into show mode if you want to hit play from start there. And that'll bring it up a little bit larger. That way we can see some of those slides just a little better.
I would definitely try right now.
Okay, but rather than worrying too much about that, why don't we just go ahead and roll on to that first slide, and we'll start moving through here. One of the things that we're thinking about here is about why would we want to do this? What is there strategic value in operating on social media? And we turned to the strategic plan. Before we move on, Evan, why don't you do you want me to try pulling up the PowerPoint slide?
I can't see what you all are saying on my end. On my end, it is full screen.
Is everyone seeing it okay? Could we just get a confirmation there, Angela?
No, Evan, it's showing you what we tested earlier, where it's just the PowerPoint and it's on still the first slide.
Okay, that's interesting. On my screen, it's on the second slide, and it's full screen.
Yeah, you may have to take it out of full screen. Now we see the second. Oh, now it's the first. Now it's the second.
Okay.
Yeah, something about the full screen is making it not work, but hopefully people can still.
We'll go from here. Perfect. Yeah. Okay. Let's just, we have a lot of fun on our team at Georgia Tech here, operating social media, telling some of these great stories that we have. But there is some strategic value to this. Like I mentioned, one of the things that we honed in on was amplifying impact. What the very first thing in our new strategic plan. And not only can we use our social media channels to express our thought leadership, to connect with people in public and private sectors, but it's also a way for position us as this sort of public voice that we are leaders and decision makers that are doing things to improve the human condition, that we are expanding access for students, we're demonstrating how we are being innovative. We're connecting with folks across the globe, and social media really offers us tools to be able to do that. On the next slide, what you'll see is some of the things that we look for in posts that we're developing for Georgia Tech. Bryce, Evan, I know you guys can probably speak a little bit to this of what we're looking for, what elevates something to for us to identify. This is something that belongs on social media.
Yeah, there are some universal truths for social media, specifically on certain platforms like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, that we're looking for one of the three V's here: visual, something that you can see, that you don't have to use a bunch of verbiage to tell, something that's eye-catching imagery that's going to stop someone from scrolling through, right? When we think about social media behaviors, we think about someone that is scrolling through a feed, and there's lots of information in that feed, and we need to make them stop. And one of the best ways to do that
Bryce,
is
you may
engaging
want
in
to
it.
move your headphone wire just a little bit. It may be brushing up against your collar there.
Okay. All right, what about now?
That's better. Yeah.
Okay, so now I'm just on my phone. I'm just on the phone, but and I'll update this in just a minute when I'm done making this point. But like I said, visual, we want to show, we don't want to tell, we want to stop people in that scrolling pattern. Visceral, something that stirs the emotions. You know, we like to think about our audience in certain types of sectors, but just in general, you know, we have a broad audience with lots of different types of people, and we're trying to find imagery and stories that surprise people, give them pride in Georgia Tech, excite them, remind them about what it was like to be here, but also tell that Georgia Tech story that we know that they love and want to hear from people at Georgia Tech and representing Georgia Tech. And then valuable. We want our content to be valuable, things that we can provide that no other account can. And that can trickle down all the way to the personal accounts. When you think about building out your own personal social media, what are you able to bring to the table in terms of information or research or peek behind the curtain that other people just cannot do?
And, you know, Evan, one of the things that we talk about a lot that also might make sense to some of our faculty members is we try to avoid using social media as a bulletin board, as just throwing out event information or trying and going beyond that.
Yeah, you're going to want to make sure that things that you provide social media are impactful. And I know for us, especially when you're kind of working with research, is that you're going to want to make sure that when you're conveying your message, that you're conveying it as simply as possible. Some of the things you all work on go over the heads of people such as myself. And so when you're taking to social media, you're just really going to want to keep your research as simple as possible and let people know how it impacts others. If you're kind of working through that mindset, it's going to be much easier for you to think about what kind of things to add to social media. Is, you know, keep it simple and how it impacts others, and, you know, maybe potentially how it could impact another field in the area with the kind of things that you're working on. And to just touch on something Stephen's point before, you guys have a valuable mindset and a valuable perspective on things. So, you know, don't try to think too much of it. The work you're already doing, your original thoughts and your original ideas are going to be enough.
What we want to do next is sort of look at specific platforms, and you'll see examples of all of these things that we mentioned as we move through some of these channels. We really wanted to focus on two platforms specifically today that we felt like provided the most opportunity for our faculty and researchers to start jumping in right now. LinkedIn being the first one. We felt like you know, a lot of people see LinkedIn as something like for people on a job hunt or business people. But in reality, it really is a platform that is for networking across the spectrum. It provides a really nice way to connect with people in a very specific field. And there is real opportunity also to share your research outcomes or opportunities within the research space, or possibly even sharing tips about working in the field that you work with. LinkedIn is one of the platforms that is changing the most. They're over the past couple of years have really built out ways for people to build their own personal profiles in terms of you can now, as a personal user, upload photos and video. You can upload long form text. You can write more of a blog post and share it with your community on LinkedIn. And that's a great way to sort of start building a social presence. It's not just like an online resume, although that is part of what LinkedIn is. But you can follow people, you can follow companies and organizations. There is hashtag functionality on LinkedIn, which means you can search through topics of conversation based on keywords. As we mentioned, you can post text and images now like you can on other platforms like Facebook or Twitter. We've really found it to be a place too where people within a professional network are sharing and celebrating achievements. What you'll see on the next slide is one of our faculty members who you may know, Dr. Yakut Ghazi, who uses her LinkedIn as a sort of curated property for all of these things that we mentioned. And this idea of curating content on your feed, making it sort of appear as you are, as the different things that you represent. So here you see that she's referring to a book that she published with a couple of her colleagues. If you look a little bit closer, you can see she's using LinkedIn's tagging functionality to highlight the colleagues that she's worked with. And that in turn, these are all, functions that you can use in a social property like LinkedIn that are expanding the reach that you have on any given post. We're going to talk a little bit later about how important it is to follow people as well. You've got another example here from one of our faculty members who, unlike what you saw with Dr. Ghazi, who is showing a little bit about some of the accolades, some of the celebrating her colleagues and achievements. Dr. Fedorov here is sharing his research. On the left, you see where he's mentioning some research that was published in Wall Street Journal, tagging some of his collaborators in the post, getting a lot of activity on a post like that on LinkedIn. But on the right, he's also sharing some of this sort of in-depth research. And what we loved about this post is he specifically said, I don't normally post this type of thing here, but I realize this could be of interest and utility to a broader community, and something to think about, right? But this idea of curating content that shows all the different parts of what you're working on is really critical when you're launching on a platform. I think the next one we're going to look at is Twitter. Bryce, you want to talk a little bit about how a faculty member might be using Twitter a little bit differently than LinkedIn?
So Twitter, by the way, is my audio better now? Okay, good.
Oh.
I switched out. I think I had some old headphones. Twitter is more niche audiences, right? A little bit less on the personal side, a little bit less of kind of like the personal achievements, and not quite as much about connecting with other people, but it's a better opportunity directly to engage other organizations, other contacts, other people that are participating in conversations around your research material or topic, as well as federal and state partners. And kind of the same way that LinkedIn and Facebook have these tagging options, obviously Twitter, you can tag people directly, or tag brands directly, or tag entities directly, and kind of insert yourself into conversations going on. It's also very important on Twitter that you can search out certain topics. You can use keyword searches and find out what people are talking about specifically, if there happens to be something that happens in current events or is happening in real time. Yeah, exactly what Rob's saying. Elon Musk's attempt to take over Twitter right now is a conversation on Twitter, and is probably of interest to a lot of people in the tech industry and elsewhere. So you have that capability to potentially insert yourself into certain conversations, or at least stay abreast of what's going on in those conversations, and kind of make your personal comments as well as your professional comments blend into that. Twitter is a place where it's a little more of the Wild West, I think, than a lot of other places, but certainly not in something to be scared of, in a way to engage in conversations as they happen real time.
Why don't we look at some examples from faculty members here as well? First, we wanted to show you some of the content that is curated on a feed from Dr. Kim Cobb, who works in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. She has been building this over years, right? Like the social media has been a tool she has seen to not only develop some of her personality, who she is as a researcher, but who she is outside of her research. So she finds ways to have intersections of this using these hashtags, kind of like what we mentioned. Is there a way that I can provide my unique perspective on the conversation? In the top left-hand corner, you'll see a photo that she posted. There was a conversation happening on Twitter where women in different professions were saying, this is how I dress like a woman. And what Dr. Cobb posted is, a hydraulic drill is my must-have accessory when I dress like a woman. That post getting over 1,000 likes, really great for her feed. Where that is impactful is sort of on the flip side, when she's building engagement through posts like that, engaging with popular hashtags, when she's sharing items like what you see of her with her undergraduate researchers who had placed in a student symposium, or even more importantly below that, on on the first day of the year this year when she's commenting about record-setting heat in Atlanta in the context of what it means about, you know, climate change. All of these things are positioning her as who she is as a researcher, but the engagement she builds on these other posts make it more likely that people are to see the things that she posts related to her research. So she does a really good job of curating an overall presence. But again, this has taken her, she's been concerted about building this for several years now. Another person we wanted to show you, Dr. Manu Platt in BME, he's letting people behind the curtain, like Bryce had mentioned a little bit when we were talking about content that is valuable and visceral. He's giving you some context of the work that he does, but also showing you the people that he works with. He was out in the community picking up samples from the Sickle Cell Foundation and took his lab out to lunch. And so he's showing them a little bit about what it's like to be in Atlanta, and they're getting a little bit more you know, learning about the community, and you're seeing that unfold in real time as Dr. Platt is posting on his Twitter account. He's also celebrating the K through 12 students that their lab works with through Project Engage, and just seeing him involved in the different projects that he works on. And what's interesting to think about here, in the bottom corner, you see the photo with Dr. Platt in his lab coat, was actually coverage from 11 Alive that was generated from Manu sharing his research on his Twitter account. The last example we'll have here from Dr. Aaron Levine. Thinking about this idea of a curated feed, Dr. Levine is even posting pictures of things that he sees on campus, along with the content that he's sharing about speeches that he's giving or new papers that have been published. You know, thinking about just sort of the spectrum of what it's like to share your experience on a digital property like LinkedIn or like Twitter. This is what it could look like. You know, and thinking about it from the perspectives that we said of visual, of visceral, and valuable, you know, there is value to sharing a pretty picture if you're walking around campus. When you build the engagement off of posts like that, it's more likely that people are going to see a post like a speech details or a paper publication, something like that. We wanted to mention Instagram and TikTok very quickly. Didn't feel like we wanted to get too far in the weeds on this, because we felt like that is also one of these platforms that may be like a tier 2 for you. But if you do have some highly visual research or great images, or mind sharing photos of yourself in a work setting, engagement really can build fast on a platform like Instagram. It's probably one of our, in terms of a percentage of engaged audience, a little bit larger. The audience does definitely skew a little bit younger. So depending on the circles that you run in, you may find that you're engaging with more students on a platform like Instagram as opposed to colleagues or researchers. But there's also the opportunity to reach a different audience, right? And we see that in a platform like TikTok that is growing very rapidly, short form video. But when you look at some of the examples of how researchers are using these social platforms, which you'll see in that next slide, it is really about the visual and adding context in maybe a little bit more exciting way. But there are people using, like in an Instagram story, taking you into their lab and then explaining to you the process of an experiment and work and showing the work that you're actually doing. We found a structural engineer who was doing a fantastic job on their Instagram account of just providing context for what they see in the real world. The photo that they shared from the top of an observation deck was not looking out at the view, because they were more interested in the pattern of the steel and how it was, you know, holding up the structure of the building. So that was really interesting. We also found a researcher at Cambridge University, an obesity researcher, was sharing meaningful information on TikTok about how to count calories and why it is different for different foods. You know, although, you know, 200 calories would be the same, you know, in the sense of a 200 calorie donut and a 200 calorie bowl of fruit are both 200 calories, but how they impact the body is going to be a lot different. You know, there are opportunities on all these places to find an audience that is interested. You just have to think about how the platform works and think about some best practices that we want to run through now about how to use these tools. Evan, you want to start with some of the ideas about just from the start, the best things to do as far as building your account?
Yeah. So of course, when you're entering social media, and of course you guys probably already have a presence somewhere, and if you're starting new, but one of the first things you want to do is try to build up your audience. So that's going to be following other people that are in your field and trying to engage with them as well. Social media is a two-way street. The more that you interact with others, the more they're likely to interact with you. And to kind of touch on a point from before about like the LinkedIn versus Twitter, I think a big, huge benefit of something like LinkedIn, if you're on there, is that you list that you work at Georgia Tech and in a certain field, and you list the universities that you've attended in the past. And so, LinkedIn will help you build that initial network of people that you work with around you or have ever worked with. And I think that will really be a good stepping stone to start. And of course, Twitter, as Bryce mentioned, is about entering a bigger conversation. But one of the first things you want to do is follow those people in your field, and LinkedIn will be a really big help for you to help you find those people that you might want to follow and engage with. I know something else on this next slide that I think is, actually, this is something else, Steve, I think you probably should get into.
Well, also this idea of following people at first, really important. What you'll start to see as you follow people, these platforms will start to suggest to you other people, right? And then you'll see, oh, yes, I know this person because, we are triangulated between a network here. So the more you start to follow people, the more content that is fed to you. And that is really important. You'll see in the sort of second part of this slide, as you follow people and build engagements, you start to build this community that is strategic to you. You'll see what people are talking about. You'll identify these topic circles that you'll likely want to be active in. You'll identify which users are more active than others. You start to maybe leave comments or liking posts. That all influences how content is fed to you in the future. And that's what really allows you to build up a social account quickly. That's why the first part of this slide, the consistency and relevancy is so important. Because if you're launching an account and you're not being active, you're not engaging with anyone, the algorithm of these social properties themselves will not be utilized to its fullest extent. You have to sort of think about developing content regularly, maybe not every day, but checking in and engaging to actually have this social tool be something that's of benefit to you. As you move on to the next slide, I think
Stephen, real quick, before I get into that, just on the following, the topic of following, I think I also just want to make a quick point, something I just thought of, but following is not an endorsement. So like if you're on Twitter or you're on LinkedIn, if you choose to follow someone, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're endorsing them. It just means that you're now connected. So think of it more as like a connection, like an information connection, because I think that traditionally, as we've looked at social media, specifically Facebook, and some into Instagram, the idea is that a follow means an endorsement. And when you think of it that way, you're thinking it from like a personalized standpoint, which what we're looking at here, when you're kind of curating your own social media presence, it's like a combination of personal and professional. So I just want to, make sure that like, if there is something that you're interested in or that you feel like would be interesting for your specific social media presence, just because you follow it doesn't necessarily mean it's like a full-on endorsement of whatever it is you might be following or what they may say and do later on their social properties.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Let's go ahead and keep moving on. I know, Bryce, Evan, I think you both have talked about the importance of keeping things simple, especially when you're sort of getting launched. It's a good way to sort of test the waters a little bit, as opposed to diving right into hard-hitting research.
Yeah, I mean, talking with Evan and Stephen, we discussed this a lot about like, how do people get started? And we've helped some folks at Georgia Tech get started with their social media accounts. And I think initially, especially with researchers and researchers that have a great story to tell, and there's wonderful things that are impacting all sorts of different industries and people around the world, is to get right into that. But really, it's about kind of building things out slowly, introducing yourself to the audience that you've built, making things simple, thinking about an image that goes with something, kind of that peek behind the curtain. As your audience grows, you're going to be able to read and react to how they react to what you're posting, so it's kind of like this give and take. Like Evan said, it's a two-way street. And I think if we went back up and we looked at the slides where we had what's his name that was doing it, Andre, so Dr. Fedorov, he's got two really good examples from earlier about
how he kind of personalizes both his posts, saying, you know, this is what our goal is as a team and as a professional. But then he's got another one later where he says, I don't usually do this, but I think this would be useful to you as the people that follow me. You know, so he's kind of personalized that account and made it really simplistic and easy for the people that follow him to pay attention to what he's doing and engage with that content.
And really, like you said, not even to provide the context to say, I might not normally share this, or here's why this research is important. Here's the goal of our research, as opposed to trying to get right into the details of it. Maybe makes it a little bit harder to engage with. Let's keep moving. One of the next things we wanted to talk about here, Evan, I think is something that you feel like really important about building from the get-go too.
Yeah, you know, when you're building from the get-go, I mean, you're going to want people to know that you're, you know, able to be found on social media. And so something that I think is just a really simple way to try and boost some early engagement is to, you know, add your social media link places, you know, once it's created. So adding it to presentation slides if you're speaking at conferences, because as you know, if people are listening, they're going to want to know more about you. They're going to be sitting there on their phones, and they're going to be looking up to see what kind of more information that you can provide them once they leave the conference. Adding it to your email signature and potentially business card. And, you know, if you're comfortable as well with, you know, students following you and the type of work that you do and want to engage, I don't see it being a bad idea to add your social link to your classroom slides as well. Because you're really going to want to build up that audience. As we said, you're going to be able to, one, know who's interested in what you have to say, and able to see what others are doing in your same field to kind of get more ideas. And I think some of the ideas that some of the examples we showed you are great for just a wide range of different reasons. And, you know, just remembering that, you know, you're not just your work, you're people as well. And so, you know, seeing Manu eating with his students, you know, obviously they're not in the lab all day. You know, there's a community aspect to what happens at a university. That's part of the reason why we're all here, of course, you know, to build and to live in this community. So showing that aspect is just as important as the research. We all know on social media that the work you do is really important, but also who you are, and showing off that you are, you know, a person who's happy to work in your field in Atlanta at a top university.
You know, one of the other things that that Angela mentioned to us that there have been some questions about is how do you deal with negative engagement? And I think one of the first things you would want to say is it's not a reason not to do this. I think there is some trepidation sometimes in the academic field of thinking that this is a minefield, and for really the most of what we see is so much good out of the social properties that we engage with. What we do from Georgia Tech's perspective, we don't remove very many comments. The ones that we do remove generally have a lot of, you know, they may be obscene in nature, and that comes with us being a higher ed branded account, having across our properties several 100,000 followers. We maybe are reaching more of a public mass than you would in a curated community that you build on a social property. But if you do run into it, here's some of the advice we would have. There are these, we refer to them as trolls, you know, basically these sort of folks lurking around the internet just trying to find an argument. We run into them from time to time, and generally what we try to do is look to see who is this person, and you know, what exactly is it that they're doing? Are they just being difficult? Are they just leaving, trying to instigate an argument or using profane language? The great thing about all the social channels is that there is actually in the terms of use that any user can remove profane language from their channel. And as a personal user, you can do that. You can delete a comment, and you actually have no blowback as a personal user to do that on an account. But if someone is just disagreeing with you, that isn't necessarily something to, stoke an argument with or to report a person for anything like that. It is, you can remember most of the platforms also have the functionality for you to report a person who is acting like that too. We generally try to click on someone's profile if we are having some sort of negative interaction and see what type of person is it. And what we quite often find is generally there are these profiles of people who don't include a clear photo of themselves. They have little to no interaction on other posts, or they have a lot of interaction that is very similar to what's happening on our page that we're seeing. You know, we may report that person or we may hide them from our page. In some cases, we have blocked people from our page. But if you do get into some sort of bind, you can always contact us, our team here, and we're happy to help you walk through the steps. But what we have found just overall is this hasn't been at a level of concern enough not to operate in these properties, or to be a reason not to utilize these tools, because they are so powerful for sharing stories and connecting meaningfully, not only with our colleagues, but with people across the world. There are a few things that we have seen in the past that you'll see that are maybe topics that you might want to steer away from, and just thinking that these could also be some topics that the Institute as a public, a public entity may not be able to back you up if you chose to share about certain topics. We're not saying that you shouldn't. You should never delve into these things. You'll see that from branded accounts, we may avoid some of these issues. But there are some things we've seen in the past that just tend to stoke this type of negative activity that you might be thinking about. But the great thing as a personal user, you have more control over the comments on your page. If you're seeing something that you don't like, you can delete it. If you want to get into a heated conversation with someone, you can choose to. But these are some things, like I mentioned, that may cause some people to look more closely at your account, see who you're working for, and to maybe raise questions about any stance that you would choose to take. Government and politics, we have to be careful from our accounts how we post about those. It doesn't mean you shouldn't as a researcher, but again, you could post on something like that, a religious related topic, and then we may not be able to necessarily back you up or support something that you posted. And that just sort of goes for sort of any hot button issues that tend to be divisive. Another thing that we see unfold quite regularly is that weather or public health issues. We saw this during COVID. We see it during times of like tornadoes or snow closing. People take it very seriously. So anytime we've tried to maybe joke about that, or maybe somebody being sick, or anything, jokes related to COVID, other brands have seen that doesn't go very well. These posts, after we post them, do live on. I mean, you can delete them, but that is something to think about when you're curating what your social property looks like, that there is the potential for these posts to live on. So quite often what we found, if it is a complicated issue, it's a good idea to maybe take the conversation offline, maybe take it to email, so it doesn't necessarily live on in a social space or generate more conversation. What we have seen too in the past is that some folks, this has happened with other brands or other faculty members or administrators. Sometimes a reshare or a repost of something controversial is seen as you taking a stance on an issue. So you may want to think twice before you shared a post that may be aligned with one of these things. That's why in general what we've seen is good to have a majority of your content as a faculty member to be around what you're working on. If your feed then becomes a lot about your personal stance on a lot of issues, it really does detract from anything that you would be trying to build that is related to your research presence. Doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. You can choose to have those social profiles to be what you want for them. But if you're looking to build it from a sense of being a thought leader, our advice would be to steer clear from some of these issues overwhelming your feed. So I think that wraps us up. Bryce, Evan, we can probably stop sharing the screen, but I wanted to check anything else that we may have missed or that we may want to talk about as we're sort of wrapping up on the time here before we maybe take some questions.
No, I think ready to take some questions. I think we laid out some good things, but I just think it's good for everybody to just remember that to just have fun with social media, right? Like take the tips that we've kind of laid out there if you're going to be starting up on things, but try not to take it too seriously. The work that you do and your unique perspective is going to be enough to really create a good following, because you guys are leading your fields in the Southeast and leading your fields in your areas and always having that unique perspective that nobody else is probably going to have in your field. So just know that that's valuable.
I saw something, Angela, as we're maybe sort of segue into questions. I saw that Rob had posted in here about some of our posts getting trolled supporting Black Lives Matter. Sometimes it's tough to know what's okay to stand up for versus being radioactive. I think one thing that we have seen is that these sort of whether an institute is going to stand up for something, those conversations unfold more on branded properties than they do on the accounts of faculty members. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't necessarily happen. But those during politically sensitive times, we've seen that really unfold more maybe on Georgia Tech's account, and that's maybe more for what some of our communications colleagues have to deal with from time to time. But if you ever got into a situation as a faculty member where something you posted was generating some negative activity, we've always got folks here that are able to sort of step in and help and assist, analyze what's going on, take an assessment, and maybe help provide some next steps if needed. But I think Bryce and Evan would agree that has been so few and far between during, for me, 10 years at Georgia Tech, that we're really trying to advocate the positive nature of these properties and what you can use it for personally, professionally, and as a tool for thought leadership. Bryce, you want to talk about frequency or cadence of posting? I see that from Walter Rich.
Yeah, so it's a little bit different for every platform, and from our flagship properties, we're trying to post at least once a day on every single one of those. That's not necessarily the case for what you may need to do as an individual. In fact, my individual Instagram, I don't think I've posted on in like 5 months. So it kind of happens that way. But I would say that for Facebook, you probably want to be posting 3 to 4 times a week. LinkedIn, probably around that same amount, because if you're interacting in those communities and you're engaging in the conversations and you're posting your research and you're getting engagement, you're going to generate more favorably in the algorithms in other people's feeds the more that you post. All right, they reward activity, specifically in Facebook and Instagram. Twitter, you can get away with being dormant for a little while and jumping into conversations, though I would recommend a couple of times a week on Twitter. You could do it as much as multiple times a day. I mean, we do have people, researchers at Georgia Tech and other people, staff, that are tweeting 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day, and it's not going to hurt or help necessarily when it comes to showing up in feeds. The more engaged your post is on Twitter, the more likely you're to show up in somebody else's feed. So the way Twitter works is that if I'm friends with Evan and Evan is friends with Angela, and Angela posts something that Evan likes, it will show up in my feed saying, Evan liked this post from Angela, specifically if it thinks that it's in my wheelhouse of something that I might enjoy based on my interactions with Evan in the past. So just keep that in mind. The more you post, the more likely you are to build your audience, the more likely you are to create engagement. But it doesn't have to be something that you need to fill a quota or anything like that. But you do need to stay consistent and relevant. That's what we were talking about, like consistency and relevancy. Making sure that what you're posting is relevant to kind of what you typically post, even from a personal account, like you're kind of creating your own content. I'll say this from my personal account, my audience, I used to work in baseball. And so my audience is heavily like sports and baseball. So I'm not going to go on there and post pictures that I took on Georgia Tech's campus very often, because they're probably not going to do very well. But if I post a stat about the Braves game, that's going to be more highly engaging for me and the audience that I've created on my personal account. So keep that in mind, that when you're on your own account, you might want to post, a great picture of you and your kids at Lake Lanier, but your audience may not care and you may not get the engagement.
I was going to mention something about frequency and cadence here too, is that what that might be helpful. We know sometimes that Georgia Tech's audience is more engaged. So the 9 to 11 a.m. time frame on any weekday tends to be a particularly engaged time for our audience. Tends to do well with research as well, because we see that that is also a time like people are at work. People are just generally in this mode of talking about work-related things. We see a drop-off in activity around the lunchtime hours, which would make sense. And there's another spike in activity around the 3 to 4 time frame. And we wondered, I think we've talked about this before, is it like that time where people are starting to like disconnect from work and they're starting to pull their phone back out? You see a dip in engagement around dinner time as well, from 5 to 8. And there's actually a pretty core segment of our audience that is engaged in the late night hours, which would make sense for our audience too. But what we see in those late night hours and then also into the weekends is that the content themes start to shift away from research to maybe more entertainment sort of driven things, especially on the weekends. So we don't post as much about research on the weekends, and we may be more likely to post a pretty picture of campus, right? Because people are in a more relaxed sort of casual mode where people are maybe more quote unquote in business mode during the weekdays in those sort of hours before lunch and after lunch. So those could be times to look at as far as when you might want to post, especially if it's related to research. Your post at 11 a.m. research related is likely to have more engagement, say, than 11 p.m. That could all be different as you build sort of your platform and the folks that you're engaging with. You may come to find, I've built a LinkedIn account, and most of my colleagues that I am associating with, they're working at 11 p.m. at night. And so when I post about my research award and at 1:30 in the morning, everybody else who was up late researching as well, working, they were sharing as well. So you'll start to see what works for you as you start to build things out. But some of those general ideas may work well for you.
Yeah, we've also seen the international community chime in on some things from time to time, whether it's specifically China or India for our flagship accounts. But we've seen like a boost in our overnight on some things because it's just now hitting the morning on the other side of the world. So if you have international studies or research going on, you might find yourself engaging in conversation at 2 a.m. with someone halfway across the world.
I just wanted to add into Walter's question about frequency and cadence. Just saying, if you don't have anything to say or the content, really don't try to be on every platform. Maybe try to pick, 1 or 2 of those platforms. For example, if you know that you don't have a lot to say, maybe don't be on Twitter if you only have 1 tweet every 3 to 4 days. If you're only going to be able to post once every couple of days, something like LinkedIn would probably be a better avenue for you. If you don't have a lot to say, you're not going to enter into those timely conversations. Because when you're creating your type of like cadence of posts, you're going to want to make sure you're flexible as well, Walter, because you're going to want to make sure that you're staying on, keeping up with things that are timely. We talked about it before in different workshops, but if it's the Grammys or the Oscars or the Super Bowl, and what your field has any connection to those things, that's the time to make that connection and make something relevant to people about something they're already talking about. And so if you're thinking about your cadence and frequency, maybe try to mentally create buckets for yourself. Each week you're like, okay, I want to post, 4 times a week on LinkedIn. I want to post about my research twice a week, and then maybe some type of personal post where you're posting yourself in a work environment and sharing something a little more behind the scenes. I think if you kind of create these buckets for yourself, it will make it easier for you each week to find something that's worthwhile to post.
There was a good question that Walter and Emily were chatting about hashtags. And what I was going to do to sort of keep that going was to suggest a couple of hashtags to look at on platforms. SciComm is a pretty active hashtag across social media platforms. And I think it's a good place to start for faculty members, because you'll see a lot of other faculty members who use that conversation stream. So that is a good one to look at to see how are my colleagues, in other places using social media and then using a curated conversation. The SciComm hashtag is generally intended for this idea of sharing research or sharing research findings, or people who work in STEM fields sharing communications under that conversation stream. And as you look on different platforms, type in SciComm and see how it looks on Instagram. What comes up when I type this in? What comes up when I type SciComm on Twitter? And I think that'll start to help you see not only how a hashtag works in conversation, but then how the different platforms use these differently. I think we've seen that hashtags, although they are functional on LinkedIn, haven't quite developed into something where it is driving conversation like it does on Instagram or Twitter. So maybe that will change as the platforms evolve. So that may be something to look at. I thought another one interesting to look at might be looking at the hashtag women in STEM, because then you're looking at a conversation stream that is going to be maybe a little bit less research focused. There is research that's going to be involved with it, but there's also people like highlighting how they personally fit into the STEM world from the perspective of being, a female in this industry. So you'll see researchers, you'll see professionals. It's a pretty popular hashtag. And what you'll see with that one, as opposed to maybe SciComm, is that you'll see oftentimes maybe some brands are trying to get involved in that women in STEM conversation. As you look at those two, you'll likely see other hashtags that have been used in those posts, and that starts taking you down the journey of seeing all the different conversation possibilities that you might be able to take part in. We didn't take, I wonder if anybody had any direct questions, Angela. We've only been taking them off the chat, but we're happy to hear from anybody if they'd like to unmute.
Sure, I have a question. I get it that Facebook is declining in relevance, but among older people, I think it's still pretty used, and a lot of the people who we might want to engage in who have a lot of power in the world are in age groups that might still be Facebook oriented. So what is your recommendation there? And do you think that's going to change over the next few years?
Yeah, I bet Bryce and Evan will probably chime in on this, and we're already seeing it change. So Facebook now has functionality that is very similar to Instagram Story, and they're encouraging people to use the Story tool on Facebook. So it looks very similar to how an Instagram feed works. We still post regularly to Facebook. I think the difference from some of these platforms that we are mentioning, as opposed to Twitter or LinkedIn, is people built their Facebook pages built on their personal their personal presence, right? Me as person, me as Stephen Norris, not as necessarily Stephen Norris, Georgia Tech employee, or Stephen Norris, Georgia Tech researcher. So that is where some of the challenge may come in, because what you'll start to find as you build on a property like Facebook is that the connections you're going to find are people probably more related to your personal life as opposed to your professional life. That doesn't mean it's not being used well by researchers. And I think all the same things apply of like what works best for us on Facebook as well as really great imagery right now. So we generally post an image with everything that we share on Facebook. We generally also share a link that drives traffic to a full explanation. We'll try to give someone sort of the headline in the status message and then link to maybe the full story, if that makes sense. But just sort of simple text posts haven't been doing as well on Facebook. You got to think too, as opposed to Twitter or LinkedIn, the type of content that you're going to be competing with on Facebook is people sharing baby pictures and birthday photos, right? So just thinking along that line, you may want to think that you're reaching a more general audience on Facebook, as opposed to a more targeted audience that you could build on a platform like LinkedIn or Facebook. So I would recommend thinking, if I'm going to post about research, I'm going to write it probably in a way I'd be explaining it to maybe my grandmother or a fifth grader, right? To keep things as sort of plain text version as possible, because the audience tends to be so broad, and focusing on trying to make sure there's a visual element with something I might post there as well. That really impacts how people might engage with content in a feed.
One of the things that I do, Julia, is we oftentimes will post the same content almost verbatim on LinkedIn and on Facebook, and I'll go back and look at the comments and see what type of conversations. And just anecdotally, the conversation on Facebook is like very congratulatory, it's not open-ended. It's, this is great, or, oh, I love what my alma mater is doing. But if you go to LinkedIn, a lot of times it's more like conversational generating, say, I love to see that my university is doing this. Hey, did you see this? Or we're working on this in this lab, because the audiences are different. And so because of that, how we have started to shift, you asked about trends in Facebook from a brand's perspective, and even I think from a lot of people that we see that are more branding themselves as social media entities, they're not going to Facebook for those conversation generating style of content creation. It is more of like sharing of one's life rather than this is a subject or a topic that I'm interested in. Aside from politics, politics you still see pretty heavily on Facebook, but a lot of industry is moving towards more of the like two-way communication street that we see on Twitter, LinkedIn, and specifically the growth in Instagram has been really, really big in that regard.
The research we've seen that does do well on Facebook almost always has a human component, and it is described as sort of in those terms. So like one of the last research posts that we posted from Georgia Tech's perspective that did really well was of the biomedical engineering team that 3D printed a throat splint for a child patient at Children's Hospital. And we were able to share some of the images too of the girl who has basically was, doctors didn't think she'd live past a couple of years. We're able to tell more of that sort of human angle of how the research has saved this young woman's life. But then like sort of general themes, like research that related to animals, like we're able to share a photo of the animal, okay, like Facebook that normally picks up and does pretty well. Or research related to like veterans, climate related things have done really well. Things about space have done really well, generally because there's some sort of image that we can share that helps make that research more approachable. And oftentimes that's what we're looking for when we are posting on Facebook is what's the image that we are going to share with this that takes the words and really represents them. And that's what helps advance the story a little bit further. Emily had asked about tools to manage and take data on what works. One of the free tools that is really great, especially for Twitter, is something called TweetDeck. There is a free and a paid version, but what you can do on TweetDeck is sort of set up streams of conversation to watch. You can monitor hashtags. You can see who's engaging with you in real time. I think that all three of us keep a TweetDeck window open quite often on our screens. And for us, we're able to see mentions of Georgia Tech in real time. You may even want to consider like setting up streams like that for yourself, not to keep it open all the time, but it makes it easier to check a lot of different things at one time. You sort of get a dashboard look at what social media looks like, particularly Twitter. So TweetDeck, I'll type it in the chat. So folks can see what that is. The free version of that, you attach your Twitter handle to it, and then the functionality is pretty easy to start typing things in and following different content streams. But, Evan, Bryce, any other tools you can think of that might be helpful?
I just wanted to hop in. I think TweetDeck is very helpful, but it just made me think about something else. I know a lot of people sometimes ask about like scheduling and about like tools they use to schedule. Now, this is just my own personal philosophy, but I usually suggest them not to schedule posts in case that was anybody's question for two reasons. One, because social media posts can come across as kind of insensitive if you're not paying attention to what's happening in the real world. So for example, if you schedule a post that just a regular research post that goes at 10 a.m., but something just happened in, like, let's say in the New York subway the other day, it's gonna come across as insensitive if you don't forget to take that down or remove that scheduled post. And the other thing is that if you build up a certain number of people, is that you're gonna want, like we said, social media is a two-way street. So you're gonna want to respond to people. So if you post something and people are commenting on it or have questions or any follow-up and you're not looking at it, then that's not gonna look good as well. So I would always try to find a time to post when you're actually, free and available. It doesn't mean you can't write it out and have everything ready to go. But that was just something that popped in my head when thinking about using tools and different things. But that's just something I wanted to throw in there.
I'll say that the social media platforms themselves have come a long way in providing analytical tools for you and follow and being able to look at the metrics. part of that is they want you to stay on their platform, right? Like they want you to stay there. They want you to post and then go look at the analytics, and then post and go look at the analytics. But because of that, it's worth using. So Facebook has the creative studio that you can go into, or the publishing insights that has a ton of great information there. Instagram's insights that are on their app, specifically on the mobile app, are very easy to look at and use in real time. Same thing with Twitter Analytics website. And so if you're looking for specific stats, those are good places to go. We could do an entire presentation on what's meaningful and what's not out of there. And it differs for every entity, for every person, and what your goals are from a social media perspective. If you're looking to grow your audience, you're looking at very different metrics than you are if you're looking to increase your impressions, right? Those are two different goals. They seem very similar, but they're different when it comes to a social media property. But those onboard, in-app, in-program insights are really, really helpful and worth looking at from time to time as you want to track your progress as you start to build out your audience. And we can talk to you more in depth if there's an individual person out there that's looking to build their Twitter account or build their Instagram account, and give you a better idea of what metrics to look for and to kind of measure yourself by as you start to put together your own stuff.
But if you wanted to do two things that would really transform your own social properties, the first one would be to follow people who are closest to you. We do that from Georgia Tech's brand. So we follow alumni, we follow students, we follow faculty members, because when we log into the platform, then we see the best stories that they are talking about. It helps inspire us to come up with the content. The other thing that we would do is engage with people, as opposed to just sharing the comment. Like, the content you come up with is very important, but the actually going in to engage with other people's posts are going to be what build your audience, right? So you can launch on Twitter and just start posting things, but essentially what you'll have if you never engaged with anything else is like this platform where you're just posting content that nobody actually engages with, sort of shouting into the void. But like, we've likened it to like standing on the street corner and just sort of, yelling out into the world. It isn't until you start talking with other people that you start to build that community. So I think we're right up at 3:30, Angela. We're always available to take questions. We appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone today. And anything else we can provide, Bryce, Evan, myself, we're always happy to.
Thank you, Stephen, Bryce, Evan. You guys rock. Thank you guys, everybody, for attending, and I'll send out the recording.
Thank you.